If you were talking to a parent who was, let's say they were homeschooling their kid, or maybe their kid was in traditional school, but they want to supplement their kid's writing education because they value good writing. They know this is a thing they want their child to get good at, but they don't really, like, they know they don't want to just do the status quo of things because obviously that doesn't work. But they're not exactly sure what they do want to either expose their kids to in terms of examples of good writing or the core skills they want to teach them or how to encourage their kid to love writing. What would be your biggest recommendations? I know that's a very broad question because it's a broad age range we're talking about, but I'm just curious what some of the biggest things are that come to mind that you think are valuable or important.
Now, I would say that there are probably a lot of kids who seem to be drawn toward writing and reading. And like you can kind of pick up on that natural inclination that they have toward writing and reading. And I think the question is like, it's less like, how do you pressure a kid? If a kid doesn't feel drawn to those things, I don't think it makes sense to pressure a kid into being drawn to those things. But if the kid is drawn to those things, and there are a lot of kids who are drawn to those things, then I would say probably a couple things. And this is a great question that I should think about and talk to some people about more. But I would say a couple things. The first thing is, don't be limited by what you believe is age appropriate for the kid. Young adult and children's stuff is cool. It can be great, but it's actually a pretty new invention. And in the 1800s, like kids would just learn to read the same kind of stuff that adults would read. And I think one of the biggest points of frustration for kids like me and my niece and some kids who I know who are talented in these areas is adults are always kind of prescribing that they should be engaging with stuff that's, quote, like age appropriate. But I was reading George Orwell when I was like 9 or 10 years old. And so, and I know that my niece, for example, is like reading well above her level at that age. And I know other kids who have been like that. So I would say encouraging them, like if you're encouraging them to read whatever calls to them, even if it seems like it might be kind of grown up for them, I would never say, oh yeah, you should kind of push the kids and young adult stuff on them at the expense of because they might already be having that radar for quality where they're like, no, Heinlein is just better than like the hot new young adult children's geared sci-fi book that's more dumbed down. So that's one thing. And another thing that I would say is with the writing part, so that's kind of the reading part, and that feeds into the writing. Like naturally, if the kid is reading stuff and they're reading stuff that they get excited about, then they're going to maybe kind of go in the direction of wanting to write stuff too. And the writing thing, I would say encourage the kid to just encourage the kid to write about the things that they get excited about and try to make space for it. Like what I end up saying about becoming a writer and becoming a good writer is it has to do with being able to detect when the moment of inspiration strikes and having some writing tools at hand at that moment. It has a lot to do with that. And you can kind of stack the deck in your favor by being in the act of writing more often. So if a kid is getting like, really, really excited talking about whatever it is, dinosaurs or outer space or whatever they might be excited about, be like, I would love to read a story about that. And then celebrate that, like when they actually produce it. I think that ultimately writing, one of the things that I have learned over time and that a lot of people agree with me about is that writing is ultimately a self-taught skill. You can kind of guide people and encourage people and give people useful things, which is why I said don't restrict their access to the really great stuff just because you feel like it's not age appropriate. But ultimately, if they have some inclination for it, they're already on a self-teaching journey of wanting to learn how to write and wanting to learn more about reading and writing and words and language. And just celebrating that and being like, and just reminding them to do it and not limiting their access to the resources would be my approach as a non-expert in these things, but that would be my strongest recommendation.
Well, what about in your personal experience? Because you went through the education system and you have this deep love of writing that is very different from what most people have learned by the time they go out on their own and are working in the real world. What are some of the things that were most impactful for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was pulled out of public school and put into, fortunately, a private school when I was 11 or 12 years old, which was awesome for my parents to recognize and do that, because I was already sort of in this place where I really didn't belong. So the things that were really great, I was already by the time I was 10 years old, I was already like writing all the time. And I always had a notebook, and I would just independently spend a lot of time writing and reading without anybody telling me to do it. And I think a lot of kids are like that if they have the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, kind of to the point that I just made, people just celebrating that, people saying, yeah, I would love to read your thing. Oh, you wrote a story? Like, I would love to read it. Please let me read it. Let me ask you questions about it. And just providing the space and celebrating it was what I needed, because I was already allocating a disproportionate amount of my time to that naturally, because it was what got me excited. And like I said, I think a lot more kids are like that than the education system will sort of realize. And then being forced to, like, I remember one experience that I had in like fourth grade was just so upsetting for me at the time. We had this book that we were all assigned. It was like a fourth grade class or whatever. We had this book we were all assigned. And the teacher said something like, okay, you have a week or whatever. And when you get back, you got to read some of this book by the time we talk about it next time, which is going to be on this day. And so I read some of the book. I read like some amount of the book. And so we all get together, and the teacher's like, how much did you read of the book? And people were like, 10 pages, 11 pages, 12 pages, 11 pages, 13 pages. I was like, oh, I read 45 pages. And the teacher got mad at me for getting so far ahead of the class. Like, the teacher actually publicly shamed me for doing that. And I was so devastated, because it's like, what does a kid even do in that situation? The teacher actually publicly shamed me for reading ahead of the group. And I mean, where do you go from there? Right? Like, so that was one of the first clues that my parents got, that they had to at least put me in some other environment. Um, And yeah, I mean, so that kind of speaks to the point of, and I met other kids when I switched to a different school. I met other kids who were more like that, who, with whatever it was they were passionate about, they would be reading 3 times or 4 times as much as everybody else, just kind of naturally. So honestly, I think it's more like, just don't crush that. Don't shame the kid for that. Like, encourage that and give them space for it, you know?